Well, I'm making sure to do this one early in the morning, so if I have to do it again later in the day, I'll have time to cool about it in that stew. He thrust his right arm out of the great window and stroked the stucco wall with his fingers. Something about a stucco wall always fascinated Elfin, and now with this wind wailing in his ears, whistling through the larch tree, moaning across the plank bridges of this brood ditch, the touch of the material helped him to think. But he was in a blasphemous and wicked mood that night, for his idol Sam had broken his promise to take him out. There, beyond Carlton Mackerel, to the weir at Carey Fitzbane, on the River Carey, where several trench had been caught this autumn, that queer fish gifted with the gift of healing. Sam had given him no better excuse for the breaking of this promise than that Mrs. Zoyland was all alone that afternoon, up at the hospital, a state of affairs that by no means seemed to justify such treatment of a friend. Alfred's restless excitement, therefore, in that wet-blowing wind, that his queer pleasure in rubbing his hand against that old weather-stained tower wall, were mingled with a bitter anger against both women and religion. He associated them together, which was unfair with that particular kind of philosophical unfairness, touched with perverted eroticism, that many famous writers have indulged in. Women were, it is true, now at this very moment, all over this silent city, nourishing the Grail in their sleep. But the great religions of the world were not founded by women. The soul of Elfin Candle, nevertheless, as this 10th of December he leaned out against the night air, rushed forth to join the souls of Philip and John in their murderous night hunt of the Grail, just as if on this night on the west wind wilds rushed through the sky, there really had been a sort of wizard Sabbath. This joining of Philip and John in their orgy of Grail killing meant no more than that if anyone could have looked down that night upon the mental area of Glastonbury, he would have seen a powerful group of masculine consciousness bent upon completing the work of the bestial King Henry and destroying, once and for all traces of this Cymric superstition. Elfin's heart yearned for Sam, and his nerves throbbed for Sam. His feverish pillow, left over there alone in the darkness now, as he sat in this huge window, could have told a pretty tale of nightly desperations, as the lad tossed and turned and quivered in his perverted passion, while week followed week, and there seemed no satisfaction from him at sight. And so his fury turned upon Sam's religion. In this the boy mixed up, wildly and blindly, in his crazy unfairness, with the existence of all the feminine persons that Sam was in the habit of meeting these days, but especially with Mrs. Zoyland. "May the curse be on her!" cried Elfin now to the flying clouds. "May the curse be on her!" He cried to the tossing wallflower, to the bending larch, to the rippled streamlet, and to all the wet, hollow, dark spaces, like the wind-swept corridors of a madhouse, that extended between Chalice Hill and Tor Hill, and between Tor Hill and Whirl Hill. May the curse be on her, and may she be sorry to death that she ever met him. This malediction was a much more singular and significant one that poor Nell would have understood. It was in reality, and the full secret purpose of Elfin's thoughts had been revealed, directed quite as much against the Grail as against Nell. For the curious thing was that when presently he began again, whispering the words aloud with intense solemnity, to curse the woman whom his hero was so constantly visiting in the hospital, he extended his curse as his outstretched fingers fumbled at the chilly stucco wall between his tower window, to that consecrated cup in the hands of his friend's father, from whom Sam was always receiving the sacrament. His boy's thoughts were all confused, and not having been yet confirmed by the Bishop of Wells, he had only the vaguest notion of the meaning of the Mass. The cup containing the wine, as those early services which, like a faithful dog watching his master, he was wont to gaze upon with the back of St. Patrick's from the back of St. Patrick's Chapel, was the same to him as the mystic Grail, lost or buried in Chalice Hill, of which he heard his parents talk. Elphin's love for Sam was too passionate to be vicious, but it was also far too intense to be innocent. And with a lover's clairvoyance instinct, he was fully aware that Sam's worship of Christ absorbed many feelings in the man, which if released would turn to human love. What Elphin did not realize was that it was this very love of Christ coming between Sam and his mistress that had given him his place, such it was, in Sam's life. Had this accursed Grail, or this sacramental cup that the boy confused with the Grail, become nothing to Sam, it would certainly not have been to the love of Elphin Cantle that he would have turned. Thus, as so often happens in the coil of human drama, the very power against which, in his blind passion, the unhappy lad was now pouring out his imprecations, was the only thing that kept him in his idol's life. Sam's pity for this lonely child was part of the grand tour de force of his life of the saint. To be interested in boys at all was totally against the grain with him. While Elphin was at the tower window of the old tavern, Nancy, having slipped from the unconscious arms of the heavily breathing Harry Stickles, was at her attic window looking on the back gardens of High Street. This west wind, blowing from the Bristol Channel, blowing from the hills of Pembrokeshire, blowing from the Isles of Grisholm, off the western shores, where round the head of Bran the blessed fluttered that song of the birds of Rhiannon, which brought death to the living and life to the dead. This west wind was more than an ordinary wind that night to Nancy Stickles. It was her sense of this west wind that had drawn her out of her bed. The feeling of it had reached her in her dreams before she awoke. Sitting on her hard bedroom chair at the window which she had managed to open wide without disturbing Harry, she now gave herself up to that power and the rush of it as it swept past her house. In the other house everyone was asleep. Not a sound reached her from the streets in front. There she was, exposed to the far-stretched sky, with its whistling cloud leaves, to the wide, wet hollows of darkness that covered the earth, and above all, to that rushing wind. About a quarter of a mile separated her from Elphin at his open window. The boy had put on his overcoat, which had been covered him in his bed. The girl wore her rough, thick dressing gown, and also a black woolen shawl. Neither of them had the remotest notion of the presence of the other, although the identity of each, the son of Mr. Cantle of the old tavern, and the wife of Mr. Stickles, the chemist, was well known to each. It was a palpable example of the way in which the desperate wishes of living creatures flung out at random upon the air counter and cancel each other's magnetic force. The boy cursed the religion of Glastonbury, and the girl blessed it. Yes, she blessed it, as she gave herself to this wild wind that had been calling to her through her dreams for the last 5 hours. Oh, how delicious it was to give herself up to it, to feel it take her completely, as she crouched there, with her strong, firm, working girl's fingers clasped together on the window-sill. I wish, thought Nancy, that it was the wind and not men who took girls. And she fell into a fantastic reverie in which she told herself a story about a bride who gave herself rapturously to an enamored wind spirit. Oh, I am so glad I am alive, thought Nancy, and the brave, optimistic girl, as she let the wind seek out her responsive breasts under a black shawl, began adding up in her mind all the good aspects of her life. She was always doing this. She found it an excellent antidote to all that was she suffered from in her husband, that plump, placid baby with eyes of insane avarice. And it always came back to the same thing, the one grand privilege she had, that of being born in Glastonbury. Her employment at Mrs. Crowe, where she was now aided by another distant relative of Tossie's, a certain Daisy Stickles, was a constant delight to her. The walk alone, through the heart of the town and past St. Benignus churchyard, was a solid pleasure, and there were times, especially after her work was done and she was returning in the evening, that she could have started skipping down the narrow Benedict Street pavement. She could even have snatched up a certain ragged little boy she was always meeting down there and hugged him to her heart and danced him up and down and made him cry with surprise and offended dignity, and all from a delight in that life that, as it poured through her sometimes, seemed to know no bounds. Certain ways of her husband's, certain mean little physical peculiarities, and Nancy was not by nature at all fastidious, made her feel sometimes as if she could not go on living with him. But she had devised all manner of devices to deal with these nasty ways, and she never felt hopelessly caught, because she was always telling herself stories of running away from him. Harry Stickles certainly did possess quite a number of peculiarities which would have been nerve-wracking to any less well-constituted girls. These nasty little ways were made much worse by the man's preposterous and incredible conceit. But Nancy had been given by nature one supreme gift, wherein only one other person in Glastonbury rivaled her, and that was John Crowe. The gift of forgetting. Harry could do something at one minute that offended her to the quick, something that so scraped, jarred, and raked her nerves that she could have rushed to the window and flung into the road one of the big colored receptacles, red and green, that mark a chemist's shop. And yet, 3 minutes later, as she sat stewing in her parlor window, what she called her fancies would begin as deliciously as ever. Nancy's fancies were simply her sudden recollection of certain moments of intense realization of her life as they had occurred several years ago. They were nothing more than the look of a particular wall, or of a particular track of hedge, a particular piece of road, of a certain hay wagon on a certain hillside, of a particular pond with ducks swimming on it, and a red cow stepping very slowly through the mud, of a load of seaweed being pulled up from the beach by struggling horses, of the stone bridge crossing the Yeo of Ilchester, of a little toll pike at Logmore that seemed to be made up as she had seen it from the top of a bus beyond Weymouth once, of nothing but whitewashed stones and tarred planks and tall brackish grasses and clouds of white dust. Nancy could never tell which of her fancies would rise up next like a fish, making a circle of delicious ripples round it, from the depths of her mind, nor did she know whether these mental pictures stored up in her brain were limited in number, and whether at a certain point they would begin recurring all over again, or whether they were inexhaustible and need never repeat themselves. I was just thinking about how I do that too. Random little snippets of memory will come back. It's been happening a lot lately. I don't know if it's my life flashing before my eyes or what. But ever since the quarantine, I've been doing that a lot more. Remembering stuff. Anyway, I hope this records so I don't have to do it again. But, I was really pissed at other time because I did a really good dramatic reading of that one. It was nice and slow. I kind of go a little fast. A nice inflection in my voice and just went away. So that time wasn't so great, so it wouldn't be so bad if I had to do it again. But I hope I don't. So until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury, I hope. Cheers.